I'm not going to speak for 1 hour. I'm going to speak a little bit less than an hour to allow some time for discussion. So if you have any questions, I would prefer to have the questions orally. I would prefer to be interrupted because I think that's more lively and will be recorded and will also allow us an opportunity to allow me an opportunity to respond in a more lively way. Today I'm meaning to speak about the role of model logic in integrative psychotherapy. And to do that, I would first need to define integrative psychotherapy and provide at least a brief overview of what I mean by the role of model logic, because model logic is a complex system of logic, and obviously I'm not going to speak about it in detail today. It is not necessary for our purposes. And before doing that, I would like to simply illustrate the role of model logic, which is a logic which is alternative to the classical narrow syllogistic logic that we're all used to. This is the logic of the possible, the logic of what we can see, the logic of what surely follows from what we know, the logic of deduction. I would like to illustrate that by recollecting a recent movie, which I think some of you might have seen. This is a film entitled The Professor and the Madman. The Professor and the Madman. It is an equalization of the relatively well-known novel by Simon Winchester, which was entitled The Surgeon of Crowthorne. The Surgeon of Crowthorne. Now, if you haven't seen the movie, the general plot, this is a film about schizophrenia. And the plot of the movie is the following. A professor of surgery, a former army officer in the American Civil War, finds himself on the streets of London and persecuted by memories from the Civil War, when he had committed a major injustice by branding a deserting soldier with hot iron on the face. He is persecuted by those memories, by the feeling of guilt, and he suffers from schizophrenia. So he finds himself in the streets of London, where he has a hallucination of the soldier coming to haunt him, coming to persecute him. And he sees the face of the soldier in one of the passers-by, who happens to be an innocent man. He then starts to chase after that man with a pistol. The man runs through the empty night streets of London, and the man reaches the doorstep of his house. He manages to ring the bell. His wife opens the door, and at the moment when the wife appears at the door, the professor, the madman, fires the pistol and kills the innocent man in front of his wife and his family. He gets arrested, he is tried in London, and he is confined to an asylum because he continues to defend himself in front of the court by appealing to persecution. He continues to claim that he is being persecuted. He asks for protection from the court. He continues to fear that the soldier will come, the spirit of the soldier will come to haunt him. And this is when the interesting part starts. He becomes confined in an asylum with an enlightened psychiatrist of those times, who finds common identity with the professor, with the surgeon, with James, and offers him understanding. Although he's confined, as a psychiatric patient who had committed a murder, he is treated in a very benevolent way. He's given all kinds of privileges by the staff. He even helps save one of the guards, and in those conditions, his illness completely recedes, and he improves to such an extent that the very surgeon, the very psychiatrist who is entrusted with keeping him in the asylum, with treating him, goes about to various judicial authorities and politicians, saying that James should not be in the asylum. He is a highly valued member of the society. He is not a sick man. He should be at large. It is not good for him to be in an asylum. This is the time when work on the famous Oxford Dictionary of the English Language starts, and because people, the editors of the dictionary, need help by citizens to catch as many English words as possible. They basically send advertisements through the newspapers around England to solicit help. And one of those advertisements arrives in the cell of Professor James, who starts to collaborate to collect the most idiosyncratic English words and becomes one of the most valuable contributors to the English dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary. As a highly valued member of society, he receives, as an anonymous person, he receives all kinds of praise from politicians. Nobody knows that he is a murderer, that he is a madman. And this progresses to the extent where the editor of the Oxford Dictionary arrives at the asylum to meet this highly valued contributor. And when he arrives, the guards say to him, we will call the director of the asylum so that you can discuss with them whether you can enter or not. And then the editor assumes that the person he's looking for is the director of the asylum, not the murderer, not the person confined in the asylum. This is the level of appreciation which James receives in his phase of being well, in his recovered phase of his illness. His recovery proceeds very consistently, and the widow of the murdered man, of his victim, gradually falls in love with him. She even encourages her children to forgive the killer of their father, and he meets their children. But because of his feeling of responsibility, of his feeling of guilt, once the woman falls in love with him, this triggers his psychosis. And he keeps repeating to himself, you killed him again. This time you killed him in her heart. And this is when the psychosis starts to spiral again. Then he mutilates himself. He inflicts harm on himself, and he starts receiving aggressive treatment, and then he worsens again. His condition worsens again until the point when he's extradited to America, receives proper treatment for schizophrenia, and then improves again and dies almost as a healthy person in his house. Now, what does the film tell us? The film tells us that what we know about mental illness, what we know about therapy, is conditional, to say the least. That there are all kinds of conclusions that we can draw about the psychiatric medical conclusions about our mental states, which really boil down to what Paul Verhaag once wrote in his book on Being Normal and Other Disorders, when he said that psychiatry does not belong to medicine because methodologically it follows the opposite principles of those of conventional medicine. And I will not elaborate that in great detail. I can answer that in the form of a discussion later on. What we know about psychosis really depends on what modal logic calls the modal worlds, the possible worlds, the sets of circumstances in which we articulate the meaning of our experiences. Just as the trauma of the Civil War and the trauma of guilt had caused James to kill an innocent man in London, the good treatment which he receives in the asylum allowed him to become one of the most valuable contributors to one of the most important national projects of England of that time. Again, the feeling of guilt triggered by love caused the psychosis to spiral, and again the good treatment he received after he had been extradited to America caused the psychosis, the so-called psychosis, to recede. So basically what modal logic tells us in this context is that unlike conventional illnesses, tumors, inflammations, bodily conditions, which do not respond that directly and that easily and that dramatically to the changes of the circumstances, mental conditions are directly influenced by the modal worlds and by the circumstances, which means that basically the very concept of diagnostics in psychotherapy, in psychiatry as a branch of medicine, has a different weight than diagnostics in other more conventional areas of medicine, as Verhaag argues. Now, what does this have to do with integrative psychotherapy? It has a lot to do with the methodology which integrative psychotherapy adopts as opposed to most conventional methods of psychotherapy, because integrative psychotherapy insists that the therapeutic change which we seek to effect in our clients is not only a change in the perceptions and their interpretations of the conditions outside them which we perceive as fixed. It is not a reframing and a reinterpretation which will allow them to metabolize their experiences more successfully and in a less traumatic way. It is rather like what some branches of Eastern philosophy suggest, an attempt to explore whether a person lives in what the Eastern philosophy calls the Dharma. The Dharma. And the Dharma is a way of life which is the most appropriate to the person, the model world, a set of model worlds, which as small universes of circumstances conduce to one's wellness or reduce one's chances of being well. There's this principle in Indian philosophy which says that if a life is fraught with difficulties, if a person faces intense and major problems in almost anything one attempts to do, this is a sign that one might live in a dharma which is not appropriate to that person, that one needs to consider changing the general circumstances of one's life, because the most natural way of living, the most appropriate context and the modal world in which one decides to pursue one's life should be such that one does things relatively smoothly. This doesn't mean that one will not have difficulties, but if difficulties are everywhere, if difficulties are the dominant aspect of one's life, then the philosophical way of the Dharma would be to consider whether one should, for example, change the place where one lives, change a social circle one is in contact with, change one's work, and things like that. Change the major elements of one's modal world, of one's circumstances. Now, following that general line of thinking, the integrative psychotherapy sees mental disorders, mental difficulties, and mental conditions such as that described in the case of James in this film, sees them as products of the modal worlds, sees them as products of the way in which we interact with the world. And there's this principle in psychotherapy which says that, you know, a brute person, a simple person, an aggressive person, a person who is not complex, who is not sensitive, can hardly suffer a breakdown. You know, in order to suffer a mental breakdown, one has to be a relatively subtle person. One has to have a highly developed sensibilities. One has to be sensitive. Most people whom we encounter when we work with them, who are diagnosed with various mental disorders, are sensitive people and fairly sophisticated people in terms of their internal structures and their ways of responding to the world. Now, can such a person live successfully in circumstances and in modal worlds which do not conduce to the more subtle aspects of interpersonal relationships? Look at the crisis which we all face now, the crisis with the coronavirus, the COVID-19 crisis, and look at the ways in which many people have responded to the measures taken by the governments. Look at the way various governments have responded to the crisis, and not all governments responded in the same way. I live in a country which responded in one of the harshest ways initially. This is a government which immediately introduced the police hour, a major lockdown. It forbade all people over the age of 65 to leave their houses for extended periods of time, 3 months and so on. So basically the results of that kind of policy were the temporary lowering of the numbers of the newly infected people by the coronavirus. But at the same time, we can only speculate about the psychological and life quality related consequences of this kind of policy. Some of the neighboring countries, on the other hand, shied away from introducing the harshest measures. They stayed at the level of recommendations. They strictly followed the constitutional guarantees of human rights and civil liberties. They consistently showed concern that the virus should be contained, but they shied away from restricting people in the brutest possible way, in the most aggressive and most repressive way. And once these measures have been abolished, we now see that the relationship between the political authorities and the citizens in those various countries are very different. People have different views of the government, which did not hesitate for a moment to lock them in their houses for 3 months, and to the government, on the other hand, in other countries, which shied away from doing that, which was careful, which was looking after the various interests, not just the epidemiological interests, and etc., etc. The principle is similar when we consider any kind of model world, any kind of social context, any kind of interpersonal relationship. If we live in conditions, if we do a job, for example, which does not conduce to the development of values, including the aesthetics of life, which is close to our sensibility, we are likely to have mental difficulties. I work a lot with people who work in the judiciary. I have quite a few clients who are judges and prosecutors. Some of these people are very sensitive and very sophisticated, but the way they have to behave every day at their workplace, the jobs that they do are such that they militate against their own sensibilities, and many of those have difficulties. Many of them drink too much. Many of them in the long term have difficulties doing their jobs because what they are required to do every day is basically contrary to some of their fundamental values and more importantly, some of their fundamental sensibilities and emotions and aesthetic preferences. You know, they have to go to an interrogation room through a corridor which is aligned with people brought in from prison who are in chains, who are in handcuffs, who are in orange uniforms, and have to make decisions which are contrary to their basic optimizing humane values, just because they happen to have chosen that kind of profession and they happen to have been intelligent and successful and socially well connected, so they made progress and they became established in that position. Now, what does integrative psychotherapy imply as a potential solution in such situations? Well, in many cases, it implies the same as the philosophy of Dharma, and that is that for a person to be able to cultivate their own sensibilities, they do have to change their model world. It is very difficult for a criminal judge who likes, to consider the aesthetics of gentleness and the aesthetics of solidarity as the fundamental binding tissue of the community where one belongs. It is very difficult for a criminal judge to be balanced with such values. It is very difficult for someone who prosecutes suspected criminals and who believes in forgiveness and who believes in harmony to be balanced if they do that kind of job. And this is only the banal, the most obvious kind of example. We often face very difficult situations which do not make us aware of the extent to which the model worlds in which we live militate against our values. And just as this psychiatrist who was treating James in the film, and Professor and the Madman, said James should not be in an asylum, he should be at large, he could as well have said James should not be in an intolerant, cold society. James should be basically immersed in an understanding, loving, and closely knit community, which will allow James the energy and the social links and the support and love which would make James healthy. James may be a madman, and the title of the film is interesting. It contains two definite articles: the professor and the madman. There almost as there are two persons in this man. One is the professor, the highly valued member of the society, and the other one is the madman. Now, whether he will be the professor or the madman depends on the society, not on him. It depends on the model world in which he is immersed. And this is what basically model logic says to us. The model logic says we do not calculate propositions. We do not conclude based on deductions of various propositions, of various premises. We calculate based on qualifiers, necessary or possible. It is undisputable that certain situations either obtain or do not obtain in our model world, in my situation. If I'm now at the countryside in my house, it is obvious that I'm not in town, right? It is obvious that I'm not surrounded by all the services offered by a big city, but I have some other things which I don't have in the city. This is an obvious thing. But is this necessarily so? If I'm depressed, if this bothers me, this is only a contingent reality which I can change. Should my psychotherapist try to help me to reconceptualize and reframe a situation which is only contingent, or should they try to elucidate it to me that most of the facts of my life are in fact contingent, and that the way I may contemplate changing those facts should be embedded in a broader framework of the Dharma, of the concept of life, of the way of life, which should be in line with my sensibilities. And the experimental way of treatment of psychiatric patients in several hospitals have really shown consistent results with this. With the introduction of the DSM-5, you're all probably familiar with that, with those problematic diagnosis with the DSM-5, which had caused all these protests by enlightened psychiatrists and psychologists and other helping professionals in the US. Many hospitals have tried, in America, have started to reconsider the traditional ways of treatment of psychiatric patients and started following this kind of model logic-based way of thinking about mental illness. In other words, relativizing the scientific status of the very concept of mental illness and tying it more to the model context, model worlds in which they become articulated. Now, one of the problems with the introduction of this kind of integrative thinking, as opposed to the segmented scientific exact way of thinking, which is traditional in psychiatry and psychotherapy, is that we often have difficulties in distinguishing between goals and interests. And one of the authors who has written most about this was Johann Galtung, when he speaks about negotiation and interpersonal relationships. And he says, if the goals of anything, in this case the goals of therapy, are set strictly based on structural criteria to make people socially functional, for example, to make people resilient, to make people more effective at what they do, then basically our concept of mental health converges with the social ideal of values, the social ideal of virtues. The closer one is to the social ideal of a perfectly desirable member of the community, the more ideal the mental health of that person tends to be considered. Now, Galtung says this is a structural way of thinking, which is connected with what we all generally are believed to think. But a structural way of thinking is not always personal, is not always based on personal values. And Galtung explains this by drawing a parallel between interests and goals. And he says, if I'm a psychotherapist, and if you're a psychotherapist, and if Sergei is a psychotherapist, and if Sari is a psychotherapist, most of us will have similar interests. Even though we may not know each other, we will be able to fairly accurately guess the interests of each other. We all have certain interests which are structural, which arise from our job, from our work, from our dynamics of our relationships with our clients. We all want to be more skillful, to have more clients, to be more well known. Right, this would be generally desirable for our profession. But this may have nothing to do with our internal values. I may be employed in a company in which it is perfectly normal that my interest should be to advance to the position of a director, but my values might be such that I just don't want to be noticed, that I want to go fishing, that I want to be, that I'm a very private person, that I only want to cultivate intimate relationships. And in this situation, people are often torn between the general structural interest and personal goals. And the same is the case with psychotherapy. So one of the questions really in integrative psychotherapy is to what extent we should serve those general structurally defined social goals and those ideals of mental health. To what extent should we serve the goals of helping people become more resilient, more effective, more socially desirable, etc., etc. You know, to what extent should we cultivate this ideal citizen, ideal member of the community, and to what extent, contrary to that, we should pay attention to the internal values and sensibilities and consider whether the actual structural demands, not only of psychotherapy, but also of the society at large, cause mental illness, cause people to become torn, cause people to be deprived of the modal worlds which might conduce to their wellness rather to their sickness. Now, James in this film, the professor, James was a highly socialized, very successfully socialized person in all phases of his life. He was a volunteer in the Civil War. He served his community. He was considered to be a highly successful military officer, right? He basically implemented a discipline which was codified in the army. He didn't do anything outside the rules of his service. When he branded the deserter, branding a deserter was a policy of the army in the American Civil War. But this was contrary to his internal sensibilities. This was contrary to who he was. And as the result of that, as the result of serving his society and serving the ideals of, if you want, mental wellness, the ideal virtues of a person in a war, who should be brave, decisive, disciplined, etc., etc., he caused himself to develop schizophrenia. Now, integrative psychotherapy is faithful to modal logic in that it does not shy away from asking itself whether the ideal of wellness, both in society and in dominant psychotherapeutic schools, might be something that makes us unwell. And this is a philosophical question. And this is why integrative psychotherapy is based on philosophical counseling. It is broader than philosophical counseling in the sense that it also works with traditional psychotherapeutic categories and concepts and techniques. But it is based on philosophical counseling because it challenges the very paradigm of therapy. Can therapy make us sicker rather than make us well? So this is where I would like to stop at this stage after half an hour and see whether you have any comments and questions and attacks or anything like that, so that we may have a discussion if you agree.
Well, I can start if nobody wants to take it away. I can start. Thank you very much, Aleksandar. It was a really interesting, enlightening talk. Definitely learned something new. Just to start with a clarification question. So, who performs integrative therapy? Is it a philosopher? Is it a therapist who is also a philosopher? Is it a philosopher who is also like somehow trained in therapy, or like, you know, what is who is that person basically? What qualifications that person do they have?
Yeah, integrative psychotherapists are people with qualifications in the humanities. So basically the training for integrative psychotherapists is open to philosophers, psychologists, to people from any area of the humanities, and they undergo 2 or 3 years of intensive training, and then they start their apprenticeship. So it is basically a humanized, philosophized version of traditional psychotherapy. The criteria for the training are very similar to the criteria for the training in any psychotherapeutic schools, both in format and in content, but the content of the training itself is more philosophical, is based on philosophical counseling and on philosophical sources.
Well, maybe another one then. So how from your perspective it could say why a philosopher, for example, would want to undertake this extra training in integrative psychotherapy? So what you in which situations, or what should be the motivations of the philosopher, so for whom you would recommend this type of extra training?
Yeah. Why would a philosopher undertake training to become an integrative psychotherapist? Well, why would a philosopher undertake any training in psychotherapy? Why would a philosophical practitioner and a philosophical counselor want to have training in psychotherapy? Well, to me, the answer is fairly obvious. As philosophers, we are used to working with concepts. And our strength as philosophers is in that field. Most psychotherapists have their strengths in interpersonal relationships, in skills of communication, in skills of creating an immediate impact on people, allowing people to sort of re-experience certain things in a different way. They focus on the perceptions, they focus on the personal experience, whereas we focus on concepts. As somebody said in a recent panel at this conference, we focus on what some of us call the truth. Let's seek the truth. Let's use the critical methodology to approach the truth. If I'm a bit hesitant about the concept of the truth. I don't know what truth is, and I'm hesitant to talk about truth. But some people do talk about truth as a basic facet of philosophical counseling. Now, how can these two paradigms be brought closer together? Many philosophers have weaknesses. Working with philosophers through training, I've seen that many philosophers have the same weaknesses which I used to have when I was a young philosopher, and those weaknesses relate to where the strengths of psychotherapists lie. We are good with concepts, with logic, with critique, but we are not very often good with immediate interpersonal contact, with the judgment of the other person's perspective, with the establishment of emotional transfer quickly, and these are skills which we can learn from psychotherapists. So I think this cross-fertilization between psychotherapy and philosophical counseling is a desirable thing, and undertaking training, if you're a philosopher, undertaking training in integrative psychotherapy is one way of achieving that. And many psychotherapists, in fact, are already achieving that by undertaking training in philosophy and philosophical counseling. So I think many traditional psychotherapists have already seen the benefits of compensating for their deficits in concepts and critical thought by taking on philosophy, whereas I see no reason why we shouldn't see our deficits in those skills of communication and therapeutic intervention, which we can learn from psychotherapists. In addition, there's a more principled reason, and that is that there is a certain theoretical poverty of modern psychotherapy, and this poverty tends to be cured by the psychotherapists getting closer and closer to philosophical counselors. Why is that? Well, most psychotherapeutic schools started as philosophical paradigms, as ways of philosophizing about the world, and gradually, as psychology as a discipline was becoming more and more entangled in those illusions about becoming a science and being closer to medicine and physics and the natural sciences. This theoretical poverty was increased, and the psychotherapy was drawn further away from its origins, from its theoretical origins, and it has now found itself in the wilderness. It has difficulty reconceptualizing the basic premises, and this is now a good situation. On the one hand, it is a crisis of psychotherapy in the traditional way, which is caused by the theoretical poverty, and on the other hand, it is an opportunity for philosophy to reclaim its place in psychotherapy. And I think we are now at an unprecedented stage in the recent history of psychotherapy, where, as Irvin Yalom once said, when they asked him about the difference between psychotherapy and philosophical work, and he said, I can't answer your question because it's the wrong question. The real question is, what are the similarities? And this was a political statement, a statement which reflected the tendency by psychotherapists to embrace philosophy, because the psychology arose away from philosophy, and it is now somehow in its practical application in psychotherapy, it is becoming it is feeling estranged, and it wants to reclaim its unity with philosophy and philosophical conceptualizations. So I think there's both a theoretical and a practical motivation to do this, if I'm clear enough in responding.
Absolutely, and I mean, on a personal basis, I actually couldn't agree more. So I thought it was maybe important to voice that that question. Actually, we were discussing the professional responsibility of practical philosophers the other day. I'm wondering whether you would go as far as saying that maybe, to be a good either therapist or practical philosopher, we may have a sort of, a duty towards our clients to actually educate ourselves to some extent, at least in this neighboring discipline, and see what it is, what are our blind spots, as opposed to that other neighboring discipline, be it for a psychologist or for a philosopher. Or would it be too much to say that from your perspective?
I would completely agree with what you suggest. I mean, what is the main means of our work with clients? If we abstract the context, whether we are philosophical counselors or psychotherapists, which I really don't think there's much difference between the two, but if we abstract that, depending on whatever we might think about it, let's abstract it. Now, what is the main means of my working with my client? It is myself. It is my person. So there's this principle in the training, which is increasingly becoming pronounced in the training of psychotherapists, and it is the principle that when you undergo training, you're not working on developing magic methodologies of, impacting your client. You're working on yourself. You're working on addressing your own blind spots. You're working on addressing your own personal qualities, which you will use as the main means to work with the client. Because the way clients respond to us is they respond to us as persons. They don't respond to us as philosophers or psychotherapists or transactional analysts or psychoanalysts or whatever. They respond to us as Alexandra, Sergey, Alexander, Jorge, Kirill, persons whom they either can associate with or whom they can't associate with, by people who help them or don't help them. And in order to be able to help them, I think we need to use our own discipline to develop our own qualities and responsibilities. And there have been, I mentioned at the other panel, there have been studies at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, which have been conducted for, I think, 3 decades, which basically yielded the result that the satisfaction and success of psychotherapy does not depend on the psychotherapeutic school, on the context, on the theory, on the background of the therapist, but exclusively on the relationship between the therapist and the client. And the quality of that relationship and the long-term effects of that relationship obviously will depend on how we have worked on ourselves through the training. So in the same way in which traditional psychotherapists with a psychological or other background work on developing themselves as philosophers, and we help them to become philosophers. In the same way, we may work on ourselves as becoming psychotherapists, and they help us to become psychotherapists. And I think becoming both a philosopher and a psychotherapist is the closest to this Epicurean idea that, the philosophy that does not cure any ills is not worth its name.
If I understand correctly, do you think the integrative psychotherapist should be a philosopher? But my question is, what what is mean philosopher? Philosopher in general, or philosopher in some direction, or some school, and so on?
I think that integrative psychotherapists are more philosophical than traditional psychotherapists. Many of them are philosophers, some are not. But the content of the training in integrative psychotherapy is more philosophical. That's all I was meaning. So there's no prejudice as to what kind of philosophy this is. This depends on the school, and this depends. Every integrative psychotherapeutic school and program is a little bit different. But this is basically the same as a situation with psychotherapy. Look at the training of psychotherapists. Most of them choose their school or methodology and their way based on all kinds of contingent criteria, who they come in contact with, what opportunities they have, what their sensibilities are. Very few psychotherapists are familiar with all kinds of different types of psychotherapy. Just the same as most philosophical counselors are not equally familiar with all kinds of philosophical traditions and are closer to one or the other and tend to use one more than the other. But I think the practice of integrative psychotherapy, just as the practice of philosophical counseling, succumbs to this principle, which I think Lou Marinoff once mentioned in one of his books, and that is a principle. He says, when you climb the hill, you may take different roads, and the scenery may be different depending on the road you take. But if the road is reliable, whichever one you take, you should get to the top of the hill eventually. So I think this principle is very much in the spirit of integrative psychotherapy. So the first question is, what would you say are the main distinctions between integrative psychotherapy and philosophical practice? I think we've already clarified this a little bit. I think philosophical practice is the foundation of integrative psychotherapy. And I think, to me, this is the easiest way to think about integrative psychotherapy. I think of it as philosophical counseling, which is enriched by psychotherapeutic literature and skills, if that's a direct and clear enough answer. Does the mind-body way of interpretation in the integrated therapy create a more philosophical interpretation of a client's choice and freedom? Yes, I mean the body as a locus of our personality and the body as a locus of our sensibility is a major aspect of integrative psychotherapy training, which I personally conduct. And there's a lot of literature in that in the Western philosophical tradition, including the tradition connected with American pragmatism. Just think of Richard Schusterman and his works on the body and the body and therapy. From a philosophical point of view, from the pragmatist point of view, just look at the American pragmatist tradition ranging back to William James and Dewey and others. All of them have mentioned the body. Just look at subcontinental philosophical traditions such as Nietzsche, who constantly spoke against who he calls despisers of the body, right? So the body is a major element in any kind of therapy, and I think the reaffirmation of the body through the modern neuroscience, which is connected with some branches of modern philosophy, really is a very dominant move today. So yes, body is becoming an increasingly focal aspect of psychotherapy. Can you elaborate on how therapy can make one sick or not? Well, as I mentioned, if psychotherapy is exceedingly normative, if it is exceedingly focused on socialization, it may cause us to decompensate. It may cause us to have issues in our personal experiences of the world. As you probably know, Jacques Lacan, in one of the two dominant traditions of psychoanalysis, believed that psychological normalcy, as he said, is the same as socialization. He believed that we learn to be normal, we learn to be socially functional, which for him was more or less the same as being normal, through the socialization function of authority in our life, and he called this social function, he called it by the name of the father, because traditionally in the French bourgeois society of his time, it was the father who performed this function in socializing the children. So he believed that this function, the name of the father, was the axis of normalcy, and he believed that both neuroses and psychoses were caused by either blocking the function of name of the father or annihilation of the function of the name of the father. And this was a major philosophical paradigm, as you know, not just a psychological and psychotherapeutic paradigm, but this way has its dangers. And I think that if therapy is too narrowly focused on socializing people into certain social ideals, it can cause serious issues and internal decompensations. And I think this film is a perfect illustration of that.
This is regarding to your reference to modal logic. I just want a clarification that we talk, the concepts necessity and possibility have been mentioned by you, but when dealing with a client, would that context be a sort of system in which we would be functioning? I mean, there would be different systems for different clients, taking their context extra, etc. into account, and that would mean going beyond what is just present to us.
Yes, I think when we talk about model logic, we talk about logic as a general way of approaching therapy. So in the same way in which when you work with a client, we don't particularly emphasize deductive logic, right? Except if you focus on critical thinking, right? But you don't, when you talk with someone about their problems, about their issues, you don't talk about the underlying logic, you just apply it, right? But the same is with modal logic, because most people, I don't know about all parts of the world. In those parts of the world where I used to work, when people come to any kind of therapy, they're already in bad shape. They've already tried everything else. They've tried to solve their problems on their own. And most people who come to therapy are not silly or incompetent. They have really tried everything, and it hasn't worked. But why hasn't it worked in some cases? It hasn't worked because it was based on what we called realistic approach. You know, we are in our Western culture, we are encouraged to be realistic. And I think from the point of view of model logic, and Galtung would probably agree with me, there's nothing worse than being realistic. Because in some situations where you have a person who has tried everything within their real circumstances and hasn't been able to solve their problem, perhaps, I'm not saying this categorically, but perhaps the way to help is to think in a model way and try to suggest to this person that what is a contradiction and impossibility in the current model world may not be a contradiction and impossibility in a different model world, and that perhaps a change in something which is seemingly unrelated to the main focus of the problem may cause conditions to change so that a different solution might become possible. But this is rarely, this seems trivial and obvious, right? But this is rarely the focus of traditional psychotherapy, which itself is the a slave of this culture of being realistic. And this is why it constantly focuses on reframing and reconceptualization. And one of the principles of traditional psychotherapy is don't try to change the circumstances, work on changing your perception of the circumstances. Well, you know, this is condescending to most people who come to psychotherapy because they've already tried most of that. You know, they've already spent a year or 2 years of their lives trying to reconceptualize. And now what they do need is a more philosophical approach about potentially taking a step back and seeing whether the model world can be changed and whether a new meaning can be bestowed from a different context.
Does this literally mean not the real world, but a possible world which would be there for the person who is coming for that integrative therapy, or the practitioner who's using it?
Let me give you a very trivial example. You often have people who have relationship difficulties. I mean, relationship issues and parenting issues and family issues are 85% of all psychotherapeutic cases in any psychotherapeutic counseling practice anywhere in the world, almost. Right? This is the general statistic. And you have people who have difficulties in their relationship. Now, how will you approach that? You will approach that differently depending on what kind of model world you take as a context. There's this, common wisdom, which I think is terrible. A common wisdom which is used by many traditional psychotherapists, and this is the wisdom that a good divorce is better than a bad marriage. In many cases, this is sheer rubbish. This is sheer rubbish because so many children have been crippled by this principle, and so many people have been devoid of the real possibilities to heal their marriages, right? But you have a different school as well. You have the so-called hope-focused marriage counseling, which takes another model world and says, okay, let's try to work through Christian faith or any other type of faith. Let's try to work through the paying more attention to the passage of time and the potential to view things differently in a year or 2 years or 3 years. Let's take it as a principle that things should be preserved rather than destroyed immediately. And this yields different interventions, right, in the consulting room. All of this depends on how you perceive and present the relevant model world to the person. I have a principle when I work with couples, when most of them come to the counseling with the question of whether they should break up or not. And if there are no obvious reasons for them to consider breaking up, such as violence and things like that, if they are the ordinary cases, I often insist on the therapeutic contract. And the therapeutic contract has one important article in it. It is an oral contract, obviously. And it's the provision that no breakup for the first month until we establish a good working relationship. And then this often extends to no breakup for the next 3 months until we see whether we can save the relationship. Because if the relationship is going to break up, it will break up anyway. There's no reason for us to work on breaking it up right away. And this is a philosophy which arises from a model world of certain assumptions, right, on my side as a therapist. And similarly, there are different model worlds in the circumstances of the client, which will result in completely different types of behavior and approaches to solving the problem, right?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And just one last question, which I now see in the chat, and which I really like to respond to. Did you work with people who are struggling to cope with life after divorce, and especially collaboration with their ex regarding children? If yes, can you tell a bit about this work? Well, this is a major topic. Yes, I have. I have a lot of experience with that. Unfortunately, I also have a personal experience with that, but I also have a therapeutic one. I think this is one of the most common problems with psychotherapy, and I think this is not a trivial, this is a problem which is highly philosophical, and it can yield completely different approaches and different results. In some cases where people try to collaborate with their exes with regard to the children, all kinds of collaborative values can be brought into play. But in other cases, I've had cases where people who came for counseling and had this dilemma were trying to be collaborative and conciliatory and trying to create the added value through negotiations and showing goodwill, and this was the wrong approach, because sometimes you need to apply the philosophy of conciliation, and sometimes you have to be a Nietzschean, and sometimes you have to encourage people to understand that a war is war. And this is again something that would be politically incorrect, seen as politically incorrect from the point of view of traditional psychotherapy. But I think there's no ready mold for this kind of cases, and each case is different. And I think our loyalty to our clients, and especially our consideration for the third parties, for the children, for those whom we don't see, is something that should really inform our conscience and our philosophical views when we approach such situations. So in some cases, conciliation and collaboration is possible, but unfortunately, in not so few cases, a war is a war. Integrative psychotherapy is a new form of psychotherapy. And I think some of the most prominent titles in integrative psychotherapy are common with modern versions of Lacanian psychoanalysis. I mentioned Paul Verhaag's book on Being Normal and Other Disorders. This is a book published by Carnac Press in London, I think in 2006. Paul Verhaag on Being Normal and Other Disorders. There are books by Bogdan Wolf, and others, and I think this is a good start. I myself have published a book, which is the textbook on integrative psychotherapy this year, but unfortunately it's in Serbian. I'm preparing the English version with Lydia Amir for Lexington, but it won't be out until 2 years from now. So I think Verhaag is a good start. Thea, do you have any other recollections from your literature? Because Thea is my colleague who does integrative psychotherapy. He is completing her training program with us, and I see her here. Maybe she has a suggestion for literature in addition to mine. If Thea can hear me, here she is.
Hi, Sasha. I'm sorry for being late for your lecture. So, well, I would also maybe mention this bioethics of creation studies also. I think it can be also interesting in this part of integrative psychology, since it is done in various parts of the life and ecosystem and personality. And I think it can be also a kind of a start of letting yourself in this integrative field of studying and approaching the human psyche. So maybe that would be also an interesting theme to look up on. I don't know if Sasha agrees. Sasha, we can't hear you.
Yeah, it is the integrative bioethics school it is the Zagreb School of Integrative Bioethics, the Croatian school, which is inclusive of integrative psychotherapy. We work with them very closely. And there are journals which they publish in English, including a journal entitled Synthesis Philosophica. We now have a special issue of Synthesis Philosophica coming out with Sergei's paper in it. And it is focused on philosophical counseling. And it is generally presented in the view of the discipline of integrative psychotherapy, but this specific issue is focused on philosophical counseling as such. But if you look at the journal, you will get all kinds of sources about the Zagreb School of Integrative Bioethics, which is close to integrative psychotherapy. Thanks, Thea. And what else do we have? Best source to learn about integrative psychotherapy. Well, that's it, basically. Well, if anybody needs any more information in an organizational vein or a training vein, please write to me, and I'll be happy to give you any other information. The war, where's the war? If the war is damaging the children, the war is always damaging someone. And if you look at how the war works, the war should always be avoided. But if the war is necessary, it's better to wage an efficient war than to wage it half-heartedly and allow a protracted war to claim so many victims in a long time. If the war must happen, then it should happen with the help of the psychotherapist and in the least damaging way. Obviously, nobody wants to have such a situation in our consulting room, but sometimes such a situation leads to resolutions. And because people, when emotional issues, especially the emotional breakup is at stake, many people tend to behave in exceedingly confrontational ways, and sometimes if this does not recede after a few years, and some persons perceive the other person's conciliatory gestures as signs of weakness, and you have limited opportunities to work with both parties, then sometimes the war needs to be fought, just as in life generally. But obviously we try to avoid that whenever possible. Thanks, Kirill. Thanks, everyone.